Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about on a motherboard is our memory. It's one of the most important things as far as the overall performance of our computer. And the motherboard, like every other component, determines what kind of memory that the specific PC, the specific system we're building can use. So motherboard memory is not just about the form factor, and there are a number of different form factors that we've had throughout the history of recent memory. And that's all called DDR, or double data rate memory. That's what the DDR stood for. In the beginning, double data rate memory was double the speed of the previous kind of memory called just SDRAM. And then we've gone through DDR generation 2, DDR generation 3, and DDR generation 4, and that's what that number means. Fourth generation DDR. And as we've changed each generation, the motherboard notch has moved so that we can't plug the same, you can see it's the exact same width, but that notch has moved, and actually the number of pins here on the memory has changed and increased as memory speeds have increased as well. So you can't put the wrong memory in the wrong type of slot, but that physical characteristic of memory on the motherboard does not directly mean that it can take all DDR4 memory. It has to be compatible. And so as memory has progressed, and this only stops at DDR4 266, it has increasingly gotten faster and faster and faster. And as it's gotten faster, we've had to make changes in motherboards, in BIOSes, in chipsets to handle that change in speed of memory. So as we look at these slots on this motherboard, we can see it says DDR4 boost right there. So we know just from looking at it, this is a DDR4 speed motherboard. That doesn't tell us what speeds of memory it has. So we're going to look a little bit about this spec list right here. As we look at this, you can see that memory has 4 memory slots, takes as much as 128 gig of RAM. But what's the speed that fits in it? And every one of these slashes is a different kind of memory that you can put in it. In this list, this is a list of all of them. So this particular motherboard takes all DDR4s, but let's look at the list. So it says it supports DDR4 5000, parentheses OC, and then there's a slash. So that is one kind of RAM. The fastest RAM it takes, and usually they're listed from fastest to slowest, is DDR4 5000 megahertz RAM, and it has to be overclocked. You have to overclock the motherboard to get it to take that speed of RAM, or by putting it in the motherboard is overclocked, meaning the motherboard was not natively designed to run at that speed, but it can run at that speed. So all of these speeds that have OCs next to them are all overclocked. So it takes DDR4 5000 overclocked, 4933 overclocked, 4800 overclocked. And you see it goes down until we get all the way down here to 2933, and it no longer has that OC behind it. That means that is the fastest non-overclock speed. That is the native speed of this motherboard. It was made to run at 2,933 million cycles per second, or 2,933 megahertz. And it also will slow down to 2800, 2666, 2400, and 2133. In my experience, I do not overclock memory. I would, if I was buying memory for this motherboard, try to find 2933. It's made to run at it without making a single change and without overclocking, which means it's probably going to be the most stable at that speed as well. So that's what I prefer to get, is that speed. And if I asked you what the native speed of this motherboard was, that's where you'd go to. You'd go to the memory section and you'd find the highest non-overclocked speed, 2933 megahertz is the fastest native speed of this motherboard. Conversely, if I said what's the slowest speed, it'd be 2133 megahertz. And if I asked you what the fastest overclock speed was, these are all things I will ask you on a test, not this one, on a motherboard with a link. You'd say it's 5000 megahertz overclocked. And that's what this particular one is. So when we look at this memory slot, we have to say, okay, it's DDR4, but what DDR4 do I want for it? What DDR4 will it take? And are there any special specifications for the DDR4 that this one has? Because DDR4, and we'll learn more about this in chapter 5 on memory, memory also has some specifications that it can have because of server memory or kind of special kinds of memory, and it doesn't take, again, them all. So when we look at the memory section of the motherboard, we have to look at the physical characteristics, the generation, those are kind of hand in hand, and then we have to look at the specifications online or in the motherboard manual to see exactly what speeds it will take, and we need to understand the difference between overclocked and native speed, because we want the fastest, in my experience, native speed that we can get. If you're really trying to press something for some specific reason, and we've got some videos we'll watch in chapter 5 that overclocking doesn't make a big enough change usually to justify the risk of overclocking, and that's why you won't see me overclocking the RAM. So that's it on the RAM slots on a motherboard.